And thank you to the entire Results Washington team for having me, and for all of you for giving me an hour of your time. Today, we're going to be talking about genius, about the 6 types of working genius. And there is no question that genius is all around us and it's in us. The only question is, do we see it? Do we hear it? And do we value it? Today, we're going to talk about genius through 3 different things: a violin, a cup of coffee, and a cookie. So if you stick till the end, that's what you'll get: a violin, a cup of coffee, and a cookie. So let's start with the violin. It has been almost 15 years since a writer at the Washington Post had a question. And his question was, what would happen if something extraordinary were to occur in an ordinary situation? He went on to win a Pulitzer Prize for the article that he wrote. And here's what he did. He partnered with Joshua Bell, who at the time and even now is known as a world famous musician. And they put Joshua Bell outside of a metro station in Washington, D.C. It was a January morning, rush hour. And the idea was to see what would happen if something extraordinary were to occur in an ordinary situation. So if we could turn chat on for just a second, because I'm curious to hear how many of you will get this answer right. Joshua Bell played violin for 45 minutes. And during that 45 minutes, just over 1,100 people walked by. How many of them do you believe stopped to hear the music? Take a guess in the chat feature. There were 1,100 that walked by. How many do you think were able to stop? I love the answers. Oh my gosh. So we've got 0. We've got everyone over 1,000. I love it. So the answer of those 1,100 people, 7 people stopped. And why is this interesting? It's interesting because how many times are we like the commuters that day? Imagine you're at a DC metro station. You've got to get to work. You've got to drop your kid off at daycare. You've got stuff you need to do. Are you going to stop and listen to this violinist? And how many times do we find ourselves feeling like Joshua Bell? We are standing there, and as he says, he was pouring his heart and his soul into that performance. How many times at work do you feel like you are pouring your heart and your soul into something and it's not being noticed? That people are just walking by. That's the lesson. If we are really going to see genius, if we're going to see it and hear it and value it in others and in ourselves, we have to slow down enough to make sure that we're not missing those opportunities. The second thing I agreed to talk about was a cup of coffee. So we've talked about the violin. What happens when you take something extraordinary and put it in an ordinary environment? Let's look at it through a cup of coffee. Just earlier this year, Patrick Lencioni wrote a book called The 6 Types of Working Genius. And in that book, he outlines this model that we're going to talk about today. And it is so simple, and yet it's so powerful. And in my experience, those are the models that work. The models that I can just look at it and understand it. I can apply it right away to my workplace. And the model that Lencioni described was designed for work. It's not an assessment that's designed for all different parts of our life, though it's certainly applicable outside of work. It was designed for work. And the working genius model, I love the way Patrick Lencioni talks about it, because he talks about it as a cup of coffee. That within this model, there are working geniuses, there are working competencies, and there are working frustrations. And of these 6, we have 2 that fall into each category. So you have 2 working geniuses, 2 working competencies, 2 working frustrations, and so do I. Anyone who takes the assessment is going to have 2, 2, and 2. And where the cup of coffee comes in is that if we are in line with our working genius. If I can show up at work and I can do the thing that brings me joy, if I can do the thing that brings me energy, that I feel fulfilled, Patrick Lencioni talks about it as if you're pouring a cup of coffee in a Yeti tumbler. I'm not sure if anyone is here from Yeti, but if you are, you're welcome for the free plug, because if you've ever used one, you can go back 8 hours later and that coffee is going to be just as hot as when you put it in. That energy is going to stay in there. When you're in line with your working genius, the energy stays there. It's not escaping. A working competency, we can do it. There's no question. Yes, we can do it. But the difference is it's not bringing us the energy. It's not bringing us the fulfillment. In that case, it's like a cup of coffee without a lid. Just a regular mug, not a strong Yeti tumbler, but just a mug. And at the beginning, you can put your hands around it and it's warm. But if you go back 8 hours later, it's not going to be there. The energy will have gone away. The working frustrations are like a cup of coffee with a hole in the bottom. That there isn't anything you can do, no matter how much you pour in, you've already set yourself up to not get the result that you need, because the energy is draining. It's always coming out. There's not enough to fill you back up. So let's look at this model and what exactly is he talking about when he describes these geniuses. I think it helps if we take one quick step back and let's talk about how work gets done. Work gets done by people through people. And if you look at the majority of work, there is a sequence that it follows. And that sequence is that we start with ideation, then there is activation, and ultimately there's implementation. So projects work by definition has those 3 phases. And it could be a huge project, a small project, whatever it is, it's going to have those 3 phases. We don't always move through them linearly. It's not as simple as, at least I don't know about you, but I spent just over 20 years working for the state of Washington. I don't ever remember someone saying, you know what, Amy, we're going to send you to a quiet, peaceful island on Hawaii, and we're going to give you 6 months to ideate. Take all the time and resources you need to ideate, and only when that's over, then let's come on back and talk about implementation. Probably not the way the world works. So the ideation and the activation and implementation, they may be crunched more than we would like. We may find ourselves going back and forth where it feels like we were moving along and now, gosh, we're suddenly back in ideation again. But that frame is incredibly important. The frame of these 3 different distinct parts of a project. Within those phases are where the geniuses lie. Within those phases are where the geniuses lie. So let's look at how this plays out. And huge kudos to Ashton from Mind Creative, who's drawing this in real time, because I think you are illustrating beautifully what a PowerPoint slide just can't do in the same way. So Ashton, thank you for sharing your talent with us. The first genius is the genius of wonder. And you'll notice as we're going through this, it will spell the word widget. So if you're someone who's looking where we're going, that's where we're headed. And this is also on the handout that the Results Washington team put in your chat feature. The first genius of wonder, these are the folks who wonder, why are things the way that they are? Why are we doing this? Could this be different? Could this be better? And what they found with individuals for whom this is their working genius, they can stay in that conversation for a while. They can stay in that ideation and thinking and exploring for a while because it's bringing them energy. They're getting energy from that conversation. And so good ideas, good projects are starting there with what if. We're ideating on what might happen. They've also identified that something may need to change. Great finders of problems, great finders of, could this be better than it is right now? It doesn't stop there though. We don't just wonder about something and have it magically come into existence. What happens next is we move into the next working genius of invention. Invention is the working genius who takes that idea, who takes the what if, what might be possible, and they start inventing what a solution could look like. What might actually work here? How can we start with what we have and build something new? What is it we can invent that would make it better? The innovators, because of their ability to solve problems, this is often what we think about when we say genius. When you say, gosh, there's a genius on this team, what we're often talking about is the inventor, because they've got the spotlight on them. It's not a flashlight, it's a spotlight. It's a spotlight shining on their problem-solving skills. And yes, while that is a genius, all of the other parts of the project are equally a genius. So let's look what happens. You've now had the ideator come up with something. They've identified a problem, they've thought about it. Now there is an inventing phase where what could this be and how might we move things around? Then it goes to discernment. So the D is for discernment. And now we are in the activation part of a project, where the discernment is an evaluation process. Is this going to work? Are we headed in the right direction? What might we be missing? Discernment, while it absolutely includes data and making data-informed decisions, discernment also includes a high level of intuition. You may work with someone who says, this just doesn't feel right to me. Or I can't put my finger on it, but something just doesn't seem right. That kind of intuition is what Lencioni is talking about. That's the discernment. Are we able to evaluate the likelihood of success? And I'm seeing that there are some technical questions coming up in the chat feature. So I am going to defer to the Results Washington team because I have a feeling that they are all over it. So I will defer, I'll refer to the Results Washington team for those. Now that we've had the discernment, we've thought about, can this work? Can this really happen the way we want it to? Then it goes to galvanizing. Galvanizing in this model is organizing and moving people and inspiring people to do what needs to be done. It's a really important step in this process because while they both occur in this activation piece, galvanizing is where now people are coming on board. And galvanizers have this amazing talent to just know who to bring in and when to bring them in. And they've got all the right people around the right table at the right time. That's galvanizing. It's being able to mobilize people and bring them back together. Once you've done that, once you've got all of these people, you've got the right folks that are doing all of the right work, then that's where we get into activation. So now we're finally in the third step of the project, the third step of the work, where we're looking at the implementation. The first part of implementation is enablement. So the E for widget is for enablement. And when we often hear the word enablement, we might have a negative connotation with that. We might think about enabling someone in a way that's negative or enabling someone in a way that's not healthy. That's not the kind of enablement that Lencioni is talking about. He's talking about the kind of enablement that allows people to do what they need to do. These are the folks that are able to see what help is needed, and they're all in. They're all in on what needs to be done. when he writes about enablement, and I love the way that he does this, he says that the enablement is responding to the human need. So within this context of work or within this context of projects, the enablement, now we're looking at the human needs. The last piece then is tenacity. The last piece is, how are we going to ensure that this thing gets done? You may have been in very similar meetings that I was in, where there were lots of really good ideas, lots of things that people got excited about, but nothing really happened. And that can feel disheartening. That can start to feel unmotivating. You can almost start to feel cynical, like, gosh, we have great ideas all the time, but are we really going to get anything done? So that's the genius of tenacity, of being able to get things over the finish line. If you take a step back and you look at this model, and again, it's in your handout, so if you want to look at it there, you've got it right there for you. You'll likely see that the most successful projects, the most successful teams are going to be the ones that have geniuses in all six. And it doesn't take long to look at this model and realize what kinds of challenges might we face if we're missing one of these. Let's say that you are on a team and you are full of ideators and you are full of activators, and you can ideate and you can activate better than anyone else in the world, but you don't have anyone who has a strong working genius for tenacity. What is a likely challenge on that team? So chat is open. Drop your answers in. What do you think? What's the challenge on a team who doesn't have anybody in the implementation genius? Yeah. All talk, no action. Absolutely. We never get closure. Yes. We have too many ideas, not enough follow through. Yes. Morale goes down. I could not agree with you more. We start to procrastinate. I'm seeing burnout, overwhelm. I just saw burnout come by 3 times really quickly. Yes, absolutely. So you can see that was less than, I think, 15 seconds. And there are a lot of examples in the chat feature of what can happen when we're missing one of these on a team. We used the example of implementation, but there are equally risky challenges with the other 2 phases too. Let's say that we don't have anyone on our team who has ideation as one of their working geniuses. We don't have anyone who drives energy from thinking about what if. We don't have anyone who naturally says, gosh, I know we've always done it this way, but what might happen if we were to do it some other way? If we don't have ideation, we miss out on all the innovation. We miss out on all the opportunities to get better. And this conference is about continuous improvement. It would go against the very spirit of why we're all gathered today if we weren't able to take the time and energy to ideate. And the exact same thing is true for activation. If you don't have people on your team who can really bring people together, who can galvanize teams around ideas, who can motivate and inspire and get the right people in the right room with the resources, if you don't have someone who can make that magic happen, then implementation is not likely to succeed. And if it does succeed, it's probably going to be painful. That's the big takeaway, that we all have working geniuses, we all have working competencies, and we all have working frustrations. Do we understand ourselves well enough to know where we fit in and where we can add value? And do we take the time and the energy to understand our team well enough so that as a team, we can manage the work appropriately? Lencioni writes that he believes one of the greatest strengths of this model is that it can reduce judgment in the workplace. And I think that is an incredible thing. I work with thousands of people a year. I've literally never met a single person who said, you know, Amy, if I could just get a little more judgment, if my boss could just judge me a little bit more than they're judging me now, that would catapult me to success. Nobody, right? Nobody in their right mind would ever say, yeah, please bring on the judgment. So let's look at how can understanding this model help us reduce judgment at work. And it's pretty simple the way that it does it. When we look at how we understand how we show up at work, and when we understand what is the value that we add, then we start to appreciate what other people are bringing too. Let's say that you and I are on a team together, and I will use my real working geniuses. So my two working geniuses are both in implementation. My two working geniuses are enablement and tenacity. So enablement means identifying what help is needed, or helping with the human need, saying I'm all in. Tenacity is getting things over the finish line. So those are my two working geniuses. And let's say that yours are not that. Yours are ideation and wonder. You want to talk about what could be. You want to invent something new. Let's say that we're on a project together, and we've never taken the time to talk about what our geniuses are. We haven't talked about what our strengths are. We haven't talked about how our strengths are actually perfectly aligned to support each other. We haven't had those conversations. Imagine if we're in a meeting and you have been brainstorming for the last 2 hours. Can you hear the little bit of judgment already? So we're in a meeting. You've been ideating for 2 hours, and you've got a marker and a whiteboard, and you're exploring all of these great ideas. And I am just trying to drill down to figure out what is the SharePoint site we're going to use. There's such a disconnect that's happening. I don't understand why you're still up here. Why are you still ideating? I thought we decided that. And you have no idea how in the world can I even be thinking about a SharePoint site when we haven't even decided what the problem is that we're going to solve. It seems like a simple example, but how many times do you think this happens in workplaces all over the world? I would guess a lot. I am a certified mediator. I specialize in workplace conflict. The amount of mediations that I have done around the disconnect of am I adding value, and the judgment of what we perceive others to be or not be adding value is a big contributor to conflict. If we can have a shared language, imagine how that meeting might have gone differently. Imagine if we had said, today our focus is ideation. We're just going to get our best ideas out there. We may not make a decision, but today it's all about ideating. Now I've got some expectations. I've got some clarity about what it is. And you're going to be in the zone. You're ideating, you're full of energy. I'm exhausted after the first 30 seconds, but I know that that's okay, because I understand that's the part of the project that we're in, and now I have something to ground it. Then as we move through the project, then we can use the language as we keep going. Now we're in activating. Now we're in implementing. There are times when we're in the implementing phase that we're going to have to go all the way back to phase one. There are times where going back to the drawing board is going to create something better than we could have ever imagined. And if we're not careful, there are times where going back to the drawing board can actually make the process doomed to succeed. That's the difference. Are we using a shared language? Where are we in this phase of work? What are the geniuses that are going to help us get there? And how do we keep our sights on moving through that process? It's not a surprise that we as humans want to spend time doing the things that we enjoy. Not a surprise. So if you're on a team of ideators, not a surprise at all that you might spend a lot of time doing that. Same thing with implementers. If you're on a whole team full of implementers, not a surprise if that's how you want to spend the time. The question though becomes, are you getting the work done that you need to? If we believe what Peter Drucker has said years ago, that every system is designed to get the results that it gets, is your system set up to get the results that you need? It's designed to get what you're getting. The question is it designed to get what you need? And there are ways within these 6 geniuses that we can start to shift what that looks like. There are ways where some can do more of one thing and less of another. It's not that we can spend our whole day in a working genius. I don't believe that that's the goal. And I think Lencioni would agree. The goal is not to find a job where all you have to do is your working genius, because that's probably not realistic. I think about some of the cabinet agencies that I've worked in. I can't imagine having gone to my director and saying, oh, thank you for that idea. Unfortunately, that's not my working genius, so I'm going to pass. Or wow, yes, this project's really important to you, but that doesn't fuel my fire, so I'm going to skip that. No, that's not the world of work. And that's not what Lencioni is trying to say. What he is trying to say is let's control the parts that we can control. Yes, there are going to be times in our day where we're in our working competencies. Yes, there are likely going to be times where we're in our working frustrations, but are we minimizing those? That's the key. If you were to look at the balance of how you spend your day, how much of your day are you in your working genius versus your competency versus your frustration? There is some really sobering workforce data out there right now. And I'm guessing that you have seen all of the same reports that I have seen. We just saw the latest report from Gallup. They just issued their State of the Workforce report, where they showed that 89% of people report not feeling engaged. 89% in the most recent Gallup report, 89% said they weren't engaged. The US Department of Labor issued a report that showed 94% of American workers reported feeling underappreciated at work. 94% of American workers said, I feel underappreciated at work. I don't know if you have ever been a part of the 89% who doesn't feel engaged. I don't know if you've ever been part of the 94% that feels underappreciated, but I know that I have. There were absolutely times in my career where I did not feel engaged. There were absolutely times where I felt underappreciated. And those were not the times when I did my best work. They're not the times when any of us do our best work. When we are engaged, when we feel appreciated, when we know that we're adding value, that's when we do our best work. Do I believe that this model can transform every single workplace in every single company? And I don't know. I don't know that. But I 100% believe that we can use it to transform our own. I 100% believe that if we look at how our geniuses line up and we can start to shift ways that we spend our day, things we spend our time on, then I believe that we can move the needle on engagement. I think we can move the needle on appreciation. One of the other most sobering pieces of workforce data that I have seen is around stress and burnout. And what Gallup reported is that in this last year, worker stress hit an all-time high. That's important because last year was also an all-time high. So it showed that this year, the workplace stress was even higher than it was during the throes of the pandemic. By their measure, workplace stress was, did I feel stressed a large portion of the day previously? That was the question. And in this last report, 44% of people said yes. 44%, that's a lot. And in addition to that, the demographic of who was most likely to feel stress were working women in the United States and Canada. That was the highest demographic of workplace stress, working women in the United States and Canada. Why does this matter? Why are we even talking about it? It matters because if we are experiencing stress, if we are experiencing burnout, it impacts everything that we do. Burnout is preventable, it's reversible, and if we use this working genius model, it can help us do that. So here's a question for you. Get your chat fingers warmed up. Of the 3 types of genius that we've talked about, you've got working genius, working competencies, and working frustrations. Which of those 3 do you think leads to burnout? They can all contribute, sure, but there was one, by and large, that contributed to burnout. Let's see what you get. Okay, excellent. This is so fun because what I'm seeing in the chat feature is how I answered this too. Before I got certified, I thought, well, yeah, it's going to be our frustrations. It felt like a trick question. Like, well, of course it's our frustration. The thing that brings us the least amount of energy is what's going to contribute to burnout. Not the case. When I heard this, it was a light bulb firework moment for me because what they found, working competencies are the ones that lead to burnout. It's our working competencies that lead to burnout. How in the heck does that happen? Well, here's how it happens. If you're in a working genius, you're doing great. You're feeling energy. You might have a lot of work to do, but it's bringing you energy. You are a Yeti cup with a strong lid. That energy is sticking right there. The working frustrations, what they found is that by and large, we tend to minimize the amount of time we're in our working frustrations. That when they looked at how individuals that completed the assessments were spending their time, not a lot of time in working frustrations. There was some, yeah, because it's work. There's going to be some frustration. There are parts of a day where we are a coffee cup with a big old hole at the bottom. And we've got to do something and it takes our energy away, and we understand that. The working competencies, that's what was causing burnout because those were a bigger portion of how we spend our time at work. And if you look at your own day, if you look at your own week, take your Outlook calendar, pull up your schedule yesterday, pull up your schedule for the coming week. How much of it is your working competencies? And if it's a lot, then you want to be able to say, whoa, time out. I am setting myself up. If I'm not careful, I'm setting myself up for burnout because the competencies are what will contribute to burnout faster than the other 2. That really matters because if we can prevent burnout, it's so much easier than having to recover from it. If we can prevent our teams from getting there, we don't have to go through all of the hard but possible work of recovering from it. So be mindful. What is in your working competencies? How much of that are you doing? It's interesting to me too that when you look at burnout and the impact that it has on individuals, since the start of the pandemic, my team and I, we have taught burnout training to thousands of people. And there's no question about the negative impact that it has. There's no question about that. Everyone would agree that there's a negative impact to burnout. What is unique though, is how and when do we recognize it? How and when do I recognize that that's what I'm experiencing? What I've seen organizations do in the spirit of being helpful with really good intentions. I have seen managers say, I understand your burnout. I heard that you're feeling burnout. Let's take some things off your plate. Or I've made the decision, I'm taking X, Y, and Z off your plate. But here's the problem. If what you're taking off the plate is part of their working genius, you're actually probably going to make burnout worse. So imagine that for a minute. Imagine if my day is full. No question, my day is too full. And my boss sits me down and says, Amy, we know we've given you too much and we're going to right size it and we're going to take these 2 projects away. And the 2 projects that they take away are the 2 projects of my day that are in my working genius. They took away the 2 projects a day when I'm a Yeti cup and I'm feeling energized. And now what I'm left with, while there may be less work in terms of quantity, the quality for me has gone way down. We've got to be careful that the solution is not just to start randomly pulling things off of people's plates. Part of the right sizing has to be, what are we taking off of the plate? And even as a team, what is it that our team needs to delay or postpone in order to ensure the health and wellness of everybody? So we talked about the violin, we talked about the coffee, let's talk about the cookie. So the cookie, when we understand our working geniuses, we can absolutely minimize the amount of judgment for other people. If I know that you're a strong ideator, rather than feeling annoyed when you're brainstorming, I can actually appreciate that quality about you. And when you understand that both of my working geniuses are in implementation, when I keep asking you who's doing what by when, I'm not trying to be annoying. I'm just going to my natural place of, how do we get this thing over the finish line? So judgment starts to go down because we understand each other better. Judgment also goes down for ourselves. When we understand our own working geniuses, we can reduce the amount of self-judgment. And here's an example of how this plays out. So 2014, I went to a new agency. I was managing the policy and legislative team. So new position, well, not a new position to them, new position to me. So I'm managing the policy and legislative team. And we get over legislative cutoff. For those of you that are familiar with the legislative process, cutoff is a big deal. You're racing, there's this hard push to get there, you get to cut off, and there's this momentary sigh of relief. It doesn't last very long because the process keeps going, but there's this little moment where, oh, okay, we made it to cut off. So we were doing what our agency always did. We had everybody in a room on Friday morning doing our ledge meeting. And this was pre-COVID, so we were all in a room, standing room only, people lined up all along the room. And at some point during that meeting, there were 2 compliments. And I call them compliments, but they didn't feel like compliments at the time. There were 2 comments that came my way. And although this was in 2014, I remember it like it just happened 5 minutes ago. The first one was that they wanted to thank me for the cookies. They wanted to thank me for bringing cookies to work. It was kind of a joke because they said, you know, we got the handwritten note from the director, Amy, but we know that that was you. And I laughed, the director laughed because yeah, that was me. I mean, he signed it, but yes, I was part of that. And then the other person said, you know, thank you for keeping the trains running on time. Thank you for helping us meet these legislative deadlines. When I heard those 2 comments, I wanted the floor to open up and just swallow me whole. I wanted a fire alarm to go off. I wanted this huge moment of discomfort and what was feeling like shame to end. I was humiliated. I was there in this new role. I was hired to be a policy and legislative director of a cabinet agency. And what was standing out was that I had brought cookies and I kept trains running on time. I was horrified, and I've carried that with me for 8 years until I saw this model. For 8 years, I've carried those comments in my head as things that brought me shame. Like, what kind of a policy and legislative director were you? They weren't talking about your strategy. They weren't talking about your policy plans. They weren't talking about bringing stakeholders together. It was cookies and trains. Like, what kind of policy director are you? 8 years later, when I saw this model, something extraordinary happened. And what I realized for the first time in 8 years, those 2 comments were about my working geniuses. Those 2 comments were my working genius. So let's see how this plays out. When they said, thank you for the cookies, never been done before. I've worked here for 20 years. I've never had a ledge director bring me a box of cookies with the handwritten note from the director. That was enablement. That was attending to the human need. It was recognizing what did that group of people who were working nights and weekends and holidays, what did that group of people need? That was enablement. And when the other person said, thank you for keeping those trains running on time, thank you for making sure we never miss a deadline, they were talking about tenacity. They were talking about the ability to bring something over a finish line. So the self-judgment that I had felt, because what I had envisioned, I was in the ideation. I thought that's where value comes in. Ideation is if you come up with a new policy idea. Ideation is if you write legislation in a way that's never been thought about before. Ideation is if you find a way to figure out how to make all these policies work together. I was completely minimizing that the other geniuses are just as equally important as the other. Once we know that, when we can release and start to minimize judgment for others on our teams, when we start to do that for ourselves, think about what happens to engagement. Chances are we may not need to be part of the 89% that aren't feeling engaged. Imagine what happens to feeling underappreciated. Rather than having 94% of us go through the day feeling underappreciated, now you're not only appreciated, but you're appreciated for the things that make you uniquely you. So I want to end with where we started. I want to end back in that train station, back in that DC metro station where the world-class violinist was playing the violin. My challenge to you is, as you head back into your workplace, try not to fall into the trap that the commuters did. And for all good reasons. They had places to go, they had things to do, they had people to see, but they were missing genius that was happening all around them. So try not to miss out on it. And if you find yourself feeling more like the violinist did that day, and it's fascinating, if you read the interviews that he did afterwards, the words that he uses to describe that experience, he says that it was nerve-wracking, it was anxiety-provoking, it was frustrating, it was disheartening. The words that he uses to describe those 45 minutes of playing are the exact same words that I hear when I work with teams. They're the exact same words that I hear as a leadership coach. So it applies everywhere. If you find yourself feeling like you're pouring your heart and your soul and no one's noticing, then what do? When they interviewed him, he went on to say that the most painful part of the whole experiment, the most painful part of the experiment for Joshua Bell, the violinist, was what happened after he stopped a song. So from the moment he stopped one song until he started the next one, that became unbearable. There was no acknowledgement. There was no appreciation. And granted, there was a high bar. He had just played at the Library of Congress. He had sold out all over the world. So what he was used to in terms of what happens at the end of a song is a pretty high bar. But I think we can all relate to that. You've done something. You finished a project. You made a hire. You balanced a budget. And nothing. What he says that he did is he started shortening the amount of time between songs. Rather than a pause, rather than a long pregnant pause, he writes that by the end, he was just going from one song to the next because it was too uncomfortable to sit in that place of not being recognized, of not having anyone appreciate it. So if you find that happening to you, then what can you do? You can find a different room. You can find a room full of people who appreciate what you're bringing, who are valuing what you're bringing, and you can also change what it is you say to yourself. Stanford researchers found that our internal voice is 7 times more powerful than anything we hear from someone else. 7 times. So what I tell myself about me is 7 times more impactful than what you tell me about me. What is it that you're telling yourself about who you are? And how can you apply your genius to minimize judgment and increase engagement? That's my challenge for you. We have got some time left for Q&A. So Teresa, can I turn it over to you? Do you have any questions that you've seen that might be good ones to chat about?
Yes, absolutely. There have been many, many questions. Looks like one of the biggest questions for you, Amy, is how do we determine what our working genius is? Is there a quiz to take that and determine that? And is there a cost associated with that?
Great question. So yes, there is an assessment. I didn't talk about it because I wasn't wanting to talk about, we're not supposed to sell the assessment. But yes, there is an online assessment. The last time I looked, it was $25 per assessment. It takes less than 10 minutes. And it will map your geniuses, and it also maps your teams. So if we were in an intact team and we all took it together, we get a map back that shows what are the geniuses, competencies, and frustrations across our team. So then we can start having some really meaningful conversations. Are we spending enough time in our geniuses? Have we accidentally or unintentionally found ourselves where we're in our working competencies all day, destined to burnout? Yeah, great question, Teresa. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Amy. Another question that came in a couple of times, can you remind us the definition of working competency and working frustration?
Yes, absolutely. So let's just do all three of them because then we have the complete package. So working genius, these are the things that are going to keep us fulfilled. These are things that naturally we feel good at, and they bring us energy. They bring us joy. You get finished doing it and you think, when do I get to do that again? So for me, that's the training part of my job. I will literally get finished with the training and I'll say, when do we get to do the next one? I was actually talking to the Results Washington team today, and I said, is it too soon to be thinking about next year? Because I just love it, right? When you love something, you're ready for the next one. Working competency, these are things that we can do. Because remember, the model is not just assessing whether or not we can do it or can't do it. It's how much energy do we get from doing it. So we can do the thing, but it might not actually be fulfilling. It might not actually be enjoyable. Working frustrations are the ones that are most challenging. These are the ones that we are least likely to do unless we are very mindfully saying, I need to do this part right now. On the map, they make it very clear. If you get a chance to take it, it's red, yellow, and green. So there is no mistake about which ones are in which of those categories.
Love it. Amy, can you be a splash of all the geniuses?
Say that again?
Can you be a splash of all the geniuses?
A splash. Lencioni would say that we all have all 6, but that they're going to be, they focus it in 2 in each of the categories. So could you have a working genius in all 6? I don't know. I think that would be too diluted. So I think if you stay true to the model, there would be 2 geniuses, 2 competencies, and 2 frustrations. I have found, at least for me, that how we lean into those can change based on context. So there may be some positions where you're able to really highlight this particular thing you do, and other projects where you can really highlight this other thing that you do. So I think it's contextual too. I think psychological safety also plays a part. Is this a workplace where it's safe to do what I'm good at? Is it safe to be able to say what I want and need? I think that's a huge component to it as well.
Absolutely. Thank you. Another great question. What if your team is missing one of the competence and you aren't able to bring in additional resources or help?
Yeah, it comes up a lot. And the way that Lencioni answers it is the same way that Clifton Strengths. If you've ever done Strengths Finder, which I love, I made our kids do it. They didn't want to take it, but they were glad they did it. If you've ever used Strengths Finder, what they say is the same thing Lencioni says. You've got 2 options. One, you bring in that competency. So do you find someone else in the organization? Is there someone else on a different team? How do you bring that in? Or secondly, what is the deliberate action to strengthen up those areas? If let's say we don't have anybody who is really good at implementation, what do we do? Are we just going to be a team that never finishes projects? Or what can also happen is maybe there's one person, it's their working competency. They can do it. They don't love to do it, but by default, they end up being the one that always gets to do it. So then you can see where the burnout comes in. I read once, never become great at something you don't like doing. Have you ever heard that? There is so much wisdom in that, because once you're good at it, what's the reward? The reward is you get more of it. So being very thoughtful and very mindful about how are we as a team, and what is it that we need to bring in, and what is it that we need to grow in ourselves and each other.
Absolutely. Love it. Love it. Let's see, we got 2 minutes left. A few more questions. How can you measure or evaluate for the different types when considering assignments?
When considering
Assignments.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's incredibly applicable, because all work is going to require one of these, if not more of these. And so to be able to say, gosh, we've got this new project, and here's what this project is going to entail. And then rather than just giving it to who we've always given it to, rather than just doing what we've always done, is that an opportunity to allow people to be in line with their working genius? Because remember, it's the working competencies that are most likely to lead to burnout. If we can provide opportunities where people are in their working genius, not only do they do a great job, but they also feel really fulfilled by that. And they feel really happy by that. So even just pausing and saying, do we have an opportunity to think differently about what we've done before? I think that's the first step.
Love it. And I guess time for one more question. It looks like a lot of people want to know, where can we find the link to this assessment? And can you remind us what the book, the assessment's based off, what book for Patrick?
Absolutely. So the book is called The 6 Types of Working Genius. And on the handout, if you look at the bottom of the handout, there's a hyperlink. So it will take you to Patrick Lencioni's webpage, where you can take the assessment, you can look at the book.